welcome to the Middle Way. So my first ever podcast guest is none other than the extraordinary Professor Robert Sapolsky. For those of you who don't know him, he is a professor in biology, neurology, and neurosurgery at Stanford University. He's a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient, and he's the best-selling author of books like Behave and most recently Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will, which is the reason that I'm speaking to him, as I myself am a researcher in free will, and I hadn't actually planned to start this podcast for at least another year, but my hand was kind of forced by this opportunity when this book came out. And so I couldn't pass up the opportunity to speak to Robert Sapolsky. I would encourage you to also check out episode 0 of this podcast, which I'll be releasing at the same time, which lays out a bit of a manifesto of the intention of the podcast. But basically, the intention is to explore ideas with values of truth, wisdom, love, critical thinking, open-mindedness. It's a response to our very polarized times. It's hoping to encourage us all, including myself, toward less tribal thinking, toward more tempered conviction, to have our convictions match logic, reason, evidence, and it's a call to us becoming more united rather than seeing one another as enemies, and to look inward and check for our own biases so that we can all move toward the only goal that's rational, which is optimizing sentient well-being. So without further ado, Robert Sapolsky. Robert Sapolsky, welcome to the Middle Way.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Absolute pleasure. So I'm extremely excited to have you joining the podcast for my first ever episode. It's quite a height to start at, and particularly excited to be joining you in the wake of your new book, Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will, which I must say is a brilliant book. The depth and breadth that you've gone to on such a complex topic and still managed to keep it entertaining and even humorous is quite a feat. So kudos to you.
Well, thank you. Although I will argue that I deserve no credit, but I guess we'll get to
it. I'm sure we will. So perhaps a good place to start is just a brief kind of elevator pitch of the thrust of the thesis of your book.
Well, unlike about 90% of philosophers and regular people on the street and stuff who believe there's things like atoms and we're made up of them, and cells and things of that sort. And the common belief is, nonetheless, that material view of the universe is compatible with believing in free will. And I'm in the subset of people who disagree. And in fact, I'm way out on the lunatic fringe in arguing that there's no free will whatsoever. And I think that's based on what we know by now about where behavior comes from. And to summarize a lot of haranguing in the book, when you look at our knowledge these days, all we are is the sum of the biology over which we had no control and the environment that it interacts with over which we had no control. And there's no room in there for a mechanism that sidesteps every bit of that.
Yeah, brilliant. Great summary. So I agree completely with everything you just said. So I think we'll have a really interesting chat because we'll get into the definitions in a moment, but by any fair labeling, I'd call myself a hard incompatibilist, which is your position as well. But I do also see the merit of at least certain elements of compatibilism, and I think it's useful for us to try to find a little bit of diplomacy between those two perspectives. And it's interesting to hear you say, you put yourself way out on the lunatic fringe by saying there's no free will. And whilst that's true if the bell curve is, general society perhaps, but in terms of people who, what you might call experts in the field and people who've thought about it deeply. I'd argue it's actually kind of the opposite, that it's a bit of a lunatic fringe idea these days to believe in libertarian free will, and we'll get to these definitions in a moment. So yeah, perhaps that's a good place for us to pivot to now. Is what do you have a definition of libertarian free will to distinguish it from what the compatibilists are talking about?
Oh, well,
that's a good groan.
it's such a well. First, you always need the sort of footnote there that this is libertarian in a philosophical sense rather than a political sense. But libertarians, being polite here, but in all the fights among the determinist compatibilists and determinist incompatibilists, the libertarians are kind of, where are they coming from, saying that in fact it's not a deterministic world at all, and somehow they're willing to ignore like the building blocks of life. So in fact, I kind of went out of my way in the book to say I got nothing really about the libertarian free willers, and I sure as hell have nothing to say about the theological free willers. Not with a 10-foot pole would I want to go near that one. So the book is mostly limited to just mud wrestling with the compatibilist determinist,
Yeah.
which survey shows about 90% of card carrying professional philosophers.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a really interesting thing to focus on here, is that at the point that you're making there is echoing what I'm saying, that it's pretty rare for people in the know, let's say, to be libertarian free willers. But I would argue that, the strong majority of people have at least some level of libertarian free will belief, and that gap between the experts and the layperson, I think, is so important. That's kind of what why I'm doing the research that I'm doing on free will, is to try to address some of what's not being looked at in that gap. So the libertarian account of free will, the way that I like to put it is something like, if we were to rewind time to a previous choice point with everything in the universe in the same state, is it possible for a person to make a deliberate choice that's different than what they made the first time, with everything in the universe totally the same? It's not randomness causing a different thing. It's a deliberate choice to do differently, even though everything's the same. And so that is, to me, is like it's been called logically incoherent before, and I like that. I think that's true, and I think it's interesting that your book is such a beautiful empirical argument against that. But I think that actually we're on slightly firmer grounding when we say, here's the logical argument, and then here's the empirical to support it, to show all the minutiae of how these things happen. What do you think about that?
Completely agree. And I think the contrast you make between sort of mainstream philosophers who are compatibilists and sort of libertarian free will people is the illogic of the libertarian stance essentially falls into the realm of what would be called like folk psychology or folk philosophy, stuff that is so powered by intuition and so powered by, not being too dismissive here, but emotionally driven wishful thinking, that internal logic is not a high priority in the slightest. So in the realm of your everyday person on the street, in fact, they're not somebody typically thinking about, well, how do we reconcile action potentials and neurons with free will? They're functioning in the folk psychology of traditional libertarian thinking.
Yeah, totally. Yep. Here. Agree completely. So I think it's just worth kind of emphasizing that point for the audience, that I think sometimes when people hear debates about, oh, do we have free will or not? You'll have someone like a Daniel Dennett arguing we've got free will. And so a layperson's hearing, and it's quite confusing, this topic. So it's casting enough doubt in their mind for them to keep a hold of their folk intuitions. So I think it's just worthwhile emphasizing that I would put it as strongly as to say that there aren't any serious arguments on the table for libertarian free will. And so from there we go to, okay, well, what is this compatibilist claim that the compatibilists are on about? So one other thing before I get to compatibilism I wanted to ask about is, do you have much background in mindfulness or meditation? Have you trained in that in any way?
Zero. I am
Okay.
I am the most, in addition, I guess, to being unmindful, I am the most unspiritual person you will ever meet in your life. I was raised in a very devoutly, ritualistically orthodox religious stance. And when that all evaporated in a blink of an eye when I was about 14, any capacity for spiritualism went as well. So I am such a mechanist, a non-linear, non-additive, chaotic mechanist, but it I just can't squeeze the stuff in there. I think it's mainly because I just feel sort of silly when I attempt to be spiritual about something and assume I can't pull it off with sufficient self assuredness.
Sure. Yeah. So, I think that's an interesting side point, is the relationship between mindfulness or meditation and spirituality, that, historically they've been very strongly linked, and that, religion and meditation being very strongly linked. But I think we're going through an interesting phase now where, science is taking more and more of an interest in it and starting to research, and it's very tricky to research it. But, there's some really promising results coming out of it. So the reason I bring it up is that I think that it's another way in. It's kind of a first-hand empiricism to explore the nature of reality, to train in meditation, or to be mindful of your experience moment to moment. And I would argue, and Sam Harris makes this point really nicely in some of his work, if you watch closely enough your experience moment to moment, you will discover that there's no free will, and that, a thought arises, an impulse arises, an emotion arises, an intention arises. And there's merely a dance of these things moment to moment that, as far as consciousness is concerned, is kind of a mystery. It's just like, oh, now that's happening. Oh, now that's happening. Now that's happening. And that, the flip side of the free will coin is the illusory self coin. And I think I've heard you touch on this before. Well, what's your understanding of the illusory self? I know it's a tricky phrase, but go for it.
Not my area of much expertise, but
Sure.
it shows how much of a neurocognitive bias we have towards gestalting whole pictures out of incomplete ones, at doing it with certain heuristic shortcuts that turn out not to quite be the right way to do it, and thus you wind up with something completely irrational that you've signed up for. But nonetheless, I mean, someone like neuroscientist Ramachandran at University of California, San Diego, who's done some fascinating stuff with phantom limb work built around, you angle mirrors it the right way where you're looking at like a prosthetic arm, but it's angled in a way where you feel like it's yours, and somebody touches it and you perceive yourself. Because what do you know? We did not evolve to be terribly prepared for circumstances in which somebody is using a mirror and a prosthetic arm to fool us about a sense of bodily coherence that otherwise is fairly reliable. So yeah, there's all sorts of vulnerable parts. That said, with the mindfulness, actually, my origins in science was in stress biology and stress to the brain, and a little bit of the world of stress management. And it is absolutely clear meditation is one of the greatest stress management tools out there. Mindfulness as well. There's a whole bunch of constraints as to how to do it right. You don't do it when you're on hold on the phone, etc. All of that. But nonetheless, when it's done right and it's carefully researched, which is hard as hell, it does have some health benefits. So that's absolutely clear. That said, simply because of my makeup, if I were to meditate 20 minutes a day, I would have a stroke by the end of the week. It's so antithetical to what I'm about. But
Sure.
nonetheless, yes, health psychology is very clear about its potential benefits on the average.
Yeah, yeah, on the average, an important qualifier there, hey. So, yeah, just that, that I see that mindfulness angle as helping to see the illusory self side of things as well, that it's not that there aren't versions of self that exist. Of course, you have a body and a personality and memories, and that these are all facets of what you might call yourself. But the most far in self that we tend to take ourselves to be in the moment, the little me, the little homunculus, the little I'm in here behind my head and I'm looking out at the world and experiencing it, that can be seen to be illusory, that experience is already a collapsing of a system, the human biological system, and the external environment. That is what experience is. So there isn't a separate experience watching that experience happen. There is just the experience. Does that make sense how I put that?
Yep. And the effort we put into trying to make a consistent self out of that. What I think is one of the most interesting things we do is try to make a consistent self out of our inconsistencies.
Mm,
Then you get someone, and we come up with ways of doing it. We'll say something like, well, I'm normally a very self-disciplined person, but when it comes to chocolate ice cream, I run amok. Yes, I'm consistently someone where this is my stable source of inconsistency. Yeah, it's this pressure to try to make a whole that doesn't have any seeming cracks in it, in terms of we are much more comfortable with our notion of ourselves as coherent selves than fragmented ones.
yeah, and that idea of comfort with idea of self, or comfort with belief in free will, I think is a key thing that we come up against when we start trying to say things like free will doesn't exist, or this version of a self isn't quite what you think it is. It's very disquieting for people to be confronted with that. I think that's part of the challenge. So we're clearly completely on the same page about the kind of free will that most people seem to think they have, but and yet I have an affinity for elements of the compatibilist position. So if we say that at the broadest level, compatibilism is saying that there is, yet it gets named from being compatible with determinism. So if all events are caused by the state of the universe, the moment before and every other moment before that, plus the laws of nature, then okay, there's not that libertarian kind of free will if that's true, but there's a version of free will. And the broadest sense of that is saying that as long as you are not being externally coerced in some way, that you have a capacity to deliberate and come to choices based on your internal desires and traits and things like that. And the compatibilists want to call that free will. So would you do you concede that far, that like, yes, we have that capacity, but I just wouldn't call that free? Is that kind of your position on that?
Um, no, in fact,
Mm-hmm.
that's a stance that completely, utterly trash. Um, and just to be sort of a good house guest and be subtle about it,
No, go
um,
for it.
it incorporates into it where people intuitively go off the rails most dramatically when they think they're seeing free will. Because there's a reality that in a moment we make choices. We're confronted. Do I pick this kind of ice cream or that? Do I shoot this person? Do I not? These choices were these moments where we form intent and then we act on them. And to frame it sort of very legalistically, where intent is a big, big deal, are you consciously aware of your intent? Do you have a pretty realistic sense of what the consequences will be? And most of all, do you realize nobody's coercing you? You have alternatives. And for most people's everyday intuitive sense, and for that of most lawyers and most juries, that's necessary and sufficient to decide there's culpability. That's what free will looks like. You have an intent, you act on it, and you know that you could have done something otherwise. And where the problem comes in is with the notion that nothing has impinged on you in that moment. Because asking about that moment is the totally incorrect question. Because you were missing everything interesting that's going on, and asking, are we seeing free will because this person just picked vanilla ice cream over chocolate? is like saying you understand a book by just reading the last sentence of it, because nowhere are you asking the only question you can ask, which is, so how did you wind up being the sort of person who would form that intent at that point? And when you look at that, it's you having been coerced into that by your biology and your experience from everything from 1 second ago to when you were a fertilized egg and even stuff earlier than that. Because for the very simple reason, kind of to echo Sam Harris and such, you may intend to do something and you know you don't have to do it and all of that, but you cannot successfully intend to do something different from what you intend.
Mm-hmm.
You wish to be something other than who you are wishing for what you wish for.
Mm-hmm.
You can't will yourself to have more willpower because that's not the sort of person circumstances, parentheses, biology and environment, made you into in this moment.
Totally. So, once again, I'm finding myself in a strange position that might happen a couple more times, I think, in our chat. I completely agree with everything you said there. I feel like sometimes there is almost like it's a definitional semantic issue that we get stuck on when I watch, say, a Dan Dennett and someone like you trying to come to terms, where let's throw out the word free will for a second, right? And let's say we don't have free will. Let's say someone says that humans have an evolved capacity that normally functioning adults have that allows them to not merely act impulsively, but to pause, deliberate, consider reasons, and attempt to make wiser choices given the circumstances. Would you acknowledge that that's a capacity that humans have that, other animals don't have, at least to the same degree, that very young children don't have, at least to the same degree, people with cognitive deficits don't have, at least to the same degree, but normally functioning humans have at least some level of it, and then that's where it gets tricky, and I imagine that's where you want to come in and say, yes, but the level of that you have is completely determined by what came before. Yeah, anyway, I'll let you answer your own answer.
Yeah, what am I here for? You got both sides of it completely perfect. That's exactly what I would say.
Yeah.
And that the other word in there that is like a gigantic pitfall is normal.
Yeah. Yep.
Like, okay, so you got somebody who, thanks to they're not a kid anymore, they're not a teenager, they got brought up stably, they got values, they got mores, all of that, and they're pretty good at regulating their behavior. And that's consistently what they're like, except when it comes to chocolate ice cream, they can't self-regulate and they're just gluttons for that. And okay, are they normal? Or maybe there is a biological abnormality in them. Maybe they have a gene for a gustatory taste receptor in their tongue, a variant that makes them 10 times more pleasured by chocolate than the average person. So is this a normal person who has got a pathological chocolate tongue detection system? And in that realm, they don't have free will? All that's about is, that's one. If for some reason you want to spend the next 70 years studying people's tongues and ice cream, you may come up with an explanation. Oh, so that wasn't free will. There's a mechanistic explanation for why this normally so self-controlled person who would never murder anyone, nonetheless, there they go cheating on their diet again with chocolate ice cream. Oh, it's not really their fault because of this like gustatory receptor gene. Normal is the stuff that we have wrong with us that everybody else has wrong with them. And thus we are not able to view it for what it is, which is just biological variability. And abnormal, say someone's behavior is abnormal because they spent their entire fetal life being pickled in alcohol because their mother was an alcoholic and they were born with fetal alcohol syndrome. That's an easy one for us also because we know the reason why things are not quite normal with them because alcohol does crappy stuff to a developing nerve, blah, blah, blah. Okay, with that one, we can see where that came from. And okay, in 50 years of research, we can see why the normally self-controlled person has this vulnerability about chocolate ice cream. But for the rest of us, because the causes are diffuse, they're spread over space and time. They're subtle, they're invisible, they're ones we don't even know exist yet, blah, blah, all of those. It's so much harder to believe that the explanation for who we are is made of as strong of a cable as this person who has terrible problems with self-regulation because their brain was soaked in alcohol during fetal life, that it's just as deterministic in us, but it's a gazillion little microscopic threads, which when you put them all together form as much of a cable as the person with fetal alcohol syndrome, or as clearly explanatory of a cable as, oh, it's a tongue receptor. That's why they run amok with chocolate ice cream when otherwise they're highly receptive.
Yep.
Those are the easy ones. Those are the edge cases.
Yeah, totally. And then that distributed causation is like, we're horrible at that. So yes, you make that. So that is, again, I completely agree with everything you're saying. We're in danger of this becoming a very boring conversation. But so let's take that and see if we can try to find some diplomacy even there by saying, let's say we have perfect knowledge of human behavior and we can locate the cause somehow, some magically of every little, and so we can see that this person, through no fault of their own, and we're not going to heap any judgment on them and their soul, but they have this thing, that this explanation that says they aren't going to be able to resist chocolate ice cream, say, but then you have someone else that is, oh, we can see that they're not going to be able to resist, let's say we go Minority Report sci-fi on this. It's like when this moment comes up in the future, they are going to kill that person and they're not going to be able to overcome that impulse. And that any time they're in a situation where they get even mildly angry, they're going to go toward trying to murder someone. And so they don't have that capacity that, Dan Dennett would want to protect and say is free will. They don't have that control through no fault of their own, and there's no judgment on them for it. But they are, a dangerous person to society if whenever they get a bit miffed, they're going to try to kill somebody. And so, would you acknowledge then that if in that perfect world of knowledge, we would say, okay, there's a capacity that person doesn't have, and we're not going to blame them and be harsh to them necessarily at all, but we're going to even, the quarantine model I know you're a fan of, at least to some degree, we're going to take practical steps to try to deal with that situation. So there I see like a little bit of an overlap between the two positions. Can you see any overlap there?
Maybe built around sort of one thing which does not constitute a loophole, but the fact that the future is a very squishy place. The future is a very different proposition than the past. At any given moment, there are multiple possible futures out there, not because the world wasn't determined at the Big Bang or anything, but because there are elements of the universe that are unpredictable. Chaotic systems mean that you are not going to be able to predict accurately what's going to come. So even though if you've decided you have enough biological knowledge to know that this is the person who is most likely in the crowd to do whatever, some prediction is not a very strong suit of any of these sciences. And people, one of their great intuitive mistakes is deciding that because something is not predictable, it means it's undetermined. That's not the case at all. And we have this totally weird, paradoxical concept to have to assimilate, which is right now, there are multiple possible futures, but whenever the particular future that happens, it will have been determined, which is like mind-blowing, but nonetheless the case. Just grab a chart.
Yeah, you're right. Go for it.
It's in that context that, okay, we're not going to get perfect like future stuff, but we can predict some stuff about the future and about some people. And thus, oh no, are we in Minority Report? Can we constrain someone for something they haven't done yet? Hell yeah, we do it all the time. We do it all the time to protect society, and we do it so automatically we don't even notice that we're doing it. your kid has a nose cold and you keep them home from kindergarten tomorrow because they say, please, if your child is sneezing, keep them home so they don't get everybody else sick. You don't have to see that your child proved dangerous by giving everybody else coughs. You could do it preemptively. And exactly as you said, without any judgment, you don't like yell at your kid for getting a nose cold. You don't say they can't play with their toys while they're home from school that day. You don't preach to them about their soul. Well, whoa, we can do that preemptively. We can do that. That's great. We can say that like an airline pilot who, because of their cold or whatever, are taking antihistamines and thus are drowsy, don't fly.
Mm-hmm.
Don't we do that preemptively, and we don't tell them they're evil for having to take something that makes you drowsy, whatever. Yeah, we can do that. And eventually we're going to be able to do that in lots of areas in, I don't know, 500-600 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
Because, yeah, we'll get there in a lot of domains, but it's really complicated stuff. And at the moment, being able to say, we can have a just society in which kids are kept home from kindergarten before they've sneezed on someone. Yeah, we can deal with that degree of minority report sort of ethics, but
Mm-hmm.
there's more to come, and by the time we're doing it in some new area, it will seem so obvious and just intuitively clear we won't even notice that we're doing it. But there are the areas where one stops in their steps and say, whoa, this is a little bit unnerving. That's going to be a long, long haul, because however complicated you think the science of it is, it's going to be tenfold more complicated.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah. That's such a beautifully put, all of that. So I wonder then how I've heard you say things like, meritocracy and blame and punishment should be trashed basically in the name of no free will. And I think I completely agree with the sentiment of what you're getting at there, but I wonder whether there's a little bit of leeway on, again, maybe just a semantic thing of what completely trashed means, right? It's like maybe I'd err toward updated in some way, so that, would you say that we can acknowledge that for consequentialist instrumental reasons, maybe reward and even punishment, or that there's some room for that? Would you agree with that?
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Fine to use it instrumentally.
Yeah.
And if part of the instrumental power of it is spouting crap like it's virtuous to do this, and that could even be second order level instrumentalness. But as long as you don't really believe it,
Yeah.
and as long as it's for really good instrumental reason, and as long as you've worked really hard to figure out who gets to decide what counts as a good instrumental.
Very extremely good point. This is, there's theory and then there's practice, and deciding that all gets very hairy. But yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge that at least theoretically, that those things can serve an instrumental purpose, but that as humans, we historically and still currently tend to have packaged with that kind of retributive and spite and hate and moral anger and all those kinds of things. And those things, I would agree, to the degree that they're not instrumental at all, are to be completely trashed. Would you agree with that?
Yep. And there's not only is there no intellectual room for it, there's no ethical room for it either.
Totally.
And that said, it's not going to be trivial to do that,
Absolutely.
because we like to be praised, and we like to punish, and we like to gloat at bad people's misfortune, and we like to decide justice has been served when that's a complete nonsensical construct. And it's going to be tough.
It's sticky. So that's a little bit of what I'm looking at in my research. So I'm basically looking at exposing people to the idea that free will doesn't exist. And some of my materials has included a quote from you to try to help convince people. So thank you for your wise words. And so a study that I've just done showed that people were able to, when they write about an incident where they hurt somebody's feelings, they were able to be more self-forgiving and less shameful when reflecting on that after they'd been told that free will is an illusion compared to people who were told that free will exists. And importantly, there was one item measuring, but the item was, I am completely responsible for my actions. And that item was no different across the conditions. So, that's a little bit of evidence to show that they weren't just throwing out morality altogether and just letting themselves off the hook. And so I'm interested now, next I'm looking at forgiveness of others and seeing if I can get the same effect, because obviously a fair criticism of that first study as well, well, then maybe people will be a bit more selfish and let themselves off the hook, but can they extend that to others? So, yeah, I'll be very interested to see what happens there. Is there that differential tendency to let yourself off the hook, or is it something about, the logic of that is landing, and that there are other reasons maybe to move toward forgiveness, that we, culturally we have a system of, well, it's good to forgive, that's out there a little bit. So maybe, who knows? Anyway, I'll be interested to see what happens. But yes, it's going to be very sticky because, I'm not under no illusions that people in these quick lab manipulations are going to walk away and completely disbelieve free will forever, and they're just going to be self-forgiving and forgiving all the time. But yeah, because it's going to be very sticky, as you say, to push people around on that in a meaningful way.
Which is totally fascinating. And I think sort of the dichotomy you're sensing there, which is, people may be able to incorporate not being as hard on themselves about they're not beautiful enough, they're not smart, whatever absurd realm in which we're conditioned to see some sort of psychic agency or something. But those people, the equivalent, there's this huge sort of fault line between when you or someone like you or someone close to you does something really awful. Our attributions tend to be situational. Yeah, I was tired. I was so stressed. I mean, I had to get. That's why I was curt, and that's why they got this way. They hadn't eaten all day. Whereas when it's a them who does something wrong, that's what they're like. They've always been that way. They always will be that way. We do a divide there between what's situational and what's constitutional. In the same way, it's not going to be a good thing if what we come away with is deciding that I have no free will, but everybody else does.
Yeah.
If we've got some sort of solution, it would be I have free will, but nobody else does, which has its own pitfalls. But I think you were going to exactly tap into that.
It'll be interesting to see what we find, because it's very important that we don't have that attribution bias is a big part of our psyche, and to try to make sure that we are applying this hopefully wise conclusion equally to everybody is extremely important. I see that as well. So
because of the basic thing that what you do is never comparable with what somebody else does, because you will never know what their internal processes were that preceded that. And like it's a totally unfair comparison.
Totally.
By definition, it has to be.
Say that again.
By definition, it has to be.
Yep. Agreed. So I'm also interested in, there's a bit of chatter around how we might lose meaning, and there's a lot of downsides to undermining free will belief, and I totally acknowledge that, and they're real. I have maybe a bit of a unique perspective on the meaning side of it, though, that, firstly, I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not fatalistic to undermine free will, that some people kind of tilt that way. They're like, well, what's the point? And to remind people that, no, your choices, like what you said before, the future's not set. Your choices are what will make it happen. And so there's the choices you make are very important and will cause your future. And so it's not, no matter what you do, you'll end up in this situation. But in terms of the more pure meaning stuff, I think of, and this is maybe where the mindfulness stuff overlaps a bit as well, I see the idea that it is through us as a system that the universe is universing, so to speak, to be an incredibly meaningful thing, that without us as a collection of atoms and energy to be a choice making machine, then the outcomes wouldn't happen the way they happen. And so even if there isn't that libertarian free will of, oh, it's all up to me, that seems to me like a consolation meaning compared to the bigger, more beautiful meaning of it's not personal in that, oh, good, look at me do my stuff. It's just like, oh, wow, I'm part of this thing and we're all just part of this thing and it's through me that it's all happening and it's through us that it's all happening. Does that have any appeal to you, or does that sound too spiritual?
It's not too spiritual. It's very abstract and very challenging.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think absolutely accurate. I mean, a much more low rent version of it is okay at the meritocracy end. You do something amazing. How do you wind up having the stance that when everybody's telling you you're doing something amazing, to nonetheless decide, no, just the atoms that constitute me and the sculpting of it and all of that, and of like achieving this mindset? You're an amazing pianist. How do you get a mindset of, damn, how'd it turned out that I have fingers that could do this, that my brain talking to my fingers can produce something that caused people to have emotions they never even knew they had?
Mm-hmm.
Wow, how cool is it that it turned out that my hands could do this? How cool is it that it turns out that I can take out somebody's glioblastoma competently out of their brain? It's a tall order, but somewhere in there, there's got to be a goal of something resembling gratitude or wonder or whatever, that it turned out, wow, damn, I turned out to be one of these giraffe and I can reach up to trees anytime I want. That's how things turned out. That's cool. That's hard.
Yes, it is
That's
hard.
a tall order.
Absolutely. But yeah, you're right. The gratitude's the word I was going to use when you were saying that. Yeah, gratitude and wonder, I think, absolutely. To be, oh, look at this. I wound up to be this kind of person. I'm not going to take entitlement from that. I'm not going to take superiority from that. I'm going to take gratitude because it was a gift given to me. It wasn't something that I earned in a basic dessert sense of earning, even if you might say, okay, you did hard work and so you earned it in an instrumental way. But that basic dessert sense, it's like, yeah. And so all that's left is, wow, isn't that wonderful? And compassion and empathy for other people, and how great it is that you get to help other people to be grateful for being the kind of person who wound up that way. I think gratitude and wonder are great words.
But huge challenges.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And in a sense, I mean, sort of the threat of meaninglessness in all of this is sort of the Hail Mary way that we're trying to counter this with this very like desperate grasp for like somehow be grateful that you turned out to have molecules like the way you do. This meaninglessness, like this would be a counter for the, oh my God, so I've worked hard my whole life and that has something to do with my success. That had nothing to do. I have earned no praise for that. I am a kind person because I got raised in a way where I have a capacity for empathy. That has nothing to do. I'm the CEO. That has nothing to do with this. I personally am profoundly lucky. I fell in love with somebody 35 years ago and she fell in love with me back. And like, and whoa, that just has something to do with pheromones and like what my brain does with vasopressin or oxytocin. There's like this danger of mechanistically wiping out all that meaning. And one response to that is what we've just been talking about, which is just be grateful and stare in wonder at how the world turned out to give you perfect pitch by chance or something. Another one is one that I like try to hammer in at the end of the book, which is this ironic thing, which is the type of person you and I are sitting here talking about this highfalutin stuff, and the type of people who would be sitting around listening to this, and the type of people who would be go out and reading a book about this, and then coming out and saying, oh my God, if one of my good works were not really earned, like if you're bummed out by any of this, by definition, you're one of the lucky humans. You're one of the ones where the world works, where some people are treated way better than average for reasons they had nothing to do with. That's you.
Yeah.
You learned how to read. You're not protein malnourished. You're not
Mm-hmm.
homeless. You can like sit around and talk about abstractions with another interesting guy who thinks about abstract. And if this is a bummer, you're one of the lucky ones. For most people out there, at various points in their life, if not every moment since birth, they've been treated worse than average for reasons they had nothing to do with. And thus, for most people, saying there's no free will, get over it, that's not a bummer. That's liberating as hell.
Mm, totally. Yeah. I've heard it put, it's luck all the way down is such an important thing to come back to, like the turtles all the way down thing that you have at the start of
Yes.
your book. Um, yes. Yes, yes, yes. A million times yes. So another thing on the meaning is that I think it was Sam Harris once said something like, to chase meaning in your life is to mistake a philosophical problem for a psychological one, or the other way around. That meaning is, it's a human need in a way, and of course it's lean into that, and it's useful to lean into that in the ways that it is, but it's also possible at the same time to realize that that is a psychological thing that's trying to get us to it's a philosophical thing trying to get us to a psychological state, and that state is something that you can train yourself in, and of course you're only as capable as doing that as you are, to access more directly without needing to go through this, oh, but where's all my meaning? If you just if you drop that and you just exist in being, let's say, not that that's easy to do, especially consistently, but that there are at least moments where you can access the kind of state that you're looking to try to get to through meaning. Does that make sense?
Yes, and that's kind of this weird new world that Sam seems to be pioneering at how do you have completely irrationality free spirituality?
Mm.
And I don't quite understand how he's pulling it off. And at some
Mm.
point, I need to like, really get better informed
Mm.
because principle, he's like the most hard-assed he's as strong of a hard incompatibilist as
Mm-hmm.
there is anyone
Yeah.
out there. And I see him as a very sort of close fellow traveler, but somehow he's pulling that out. And I need to get more of a sense of what he's thinking about with that. But that's exactly the
Mm.
world you're contemplating there.
Yeah, so it's this is so I practice as a psychologist as well, and it's fascinating right at the edge of how science is starting to take facets of spirituality or religion, like what I was talking about before with the meditation. We're starting to get evidence for certain things and understanding why certain perspectives might work, and exporting that out of truth claims about metaphysics and seeing what we can get there. And there's obviously problems with that, because sometimes when you try to extract, you lose some of the beauty and certain other things, and there's cultural considerations there. But there's certainly, yeah, a lot of that. Well, I'm very interested in that area and do that kind of work myself as well. So, but it's a tricky space. That reminds me, you talking about Sam Harris, that some something that I think is really, I think it's important for us to grasp this moment in the free will space as I sense it. So I think, so Sam's book Free Will came out in 2012, I think it was, which is before algorithms and social media really exploded at that next level. And then your book's coming out kind of in the midst of that. And I'm sensing that it would make sense. And then I'm sensing that it's pushing it a little more into the mainstream. It was already moving that way, but with that, it's just getting out there a little bit more. And I think this is an important moment in history for us to confront this idea and to really try to figure out what the hell's going on here. And so I think it'd be wonderful to get like a roundtable event, or I don't know if you ever saw the Four Horsemen of the New Atheism movement when Dan Dennett and Sam Harris and Hitchens and Dawkins got around a table and discussed religion. I feel like we need that kind of cultural moment for free will. And I think it would be amazing to get you and Dan Dennett and Sam Harris and perhaps a couple of others and see if we can try to find this diplomacy that, even here I'm trying to get at, to try to nut out, this is what we agree on. Because even Dan is like, it's libertarian free will is a fantasy, right? And there are these moments where you and he in that debate, he's like, well, I feel like there's almost nothing we disagree on. And then it just, I feel like there's so much potential in there that at this moment where more eyes are getting on the idea, it would be really useful to have that kind of cultural moment. Do you think there's any merit to that?
I think that would be wonderful. As long as you're not preaching to the choir, and recognizing that even if you're avoiding that, you're preaching to a very small subset of people. Earlier this week, I did this Zoom thing with state of California. Has all the states in the U.S. have Supreme Courts, in addition to the big Supreme Court there. And just below that, they have a level of appellate courts. And this was like the annual meeting of California's highest level appellate court judges. And I got invited to talk to them for 2 hours about free will. And like, that was kind of cool in that those are people who sort of like have some influence, and they, from the moment they decided they were heading towards law school, signed up for a model of individual responsibility and culpability. And like, okay, it would be great to hang out with Sam and Derek Pereboom and a few more, and all of us agree to agree or agree to disagree on little minutiae stuff. Damn, if you can get like judges thinking differently, or school teachers thinking differently when they're assessing why this kid can't pay attention and is a total misery and they just want him out of their classroom, or a doctor trying to assess why this person just isn't losing weight and they know they're going to have a heart attack if they don't do something about this, but what's their problem? And we got a lot of versions of people who, if you could get to them, that would be impactful.
Yeah. So I guess that's I guess the separate question is how we make that happen. But that's kind of the picture that I'm painting, is if we can create an artifact that can get to people in some way, in the way that that New Atheist Roundtable did kind of go viral for, that kind of a discussion. And that, if we can just find a way to get those heads together and then it's exportable to certain places, I feel like that would just be such a powerful artifact where here's a distillation of, big thinkers on it. And then now we can get it to people somehow. So I don't know. We need to figure out some kind of a promoter person who understands how all that stuff works. So I have a big picture question for you. I'd love you to answer. So, as with your deep understanding of biology and the evolution of how we've come to be the way we are, I'm interested to look forward and cast our imaginations out to what we could be in the future. So part of the middle way idea with my podcast is around trying to bring us toward transcending kind of tribalism and more unification, and where could we get to if we were more unified. And that doesn't mean that we don't have diversity of thought and all of that's wonderful, but that we do it from a place of unity or more unity. And so, I've got a little thought experiment for you. Let's say that humanity survives, because it's a big if. Let's say that we survive for another. So this is based on Christopher Hitchens once said a thing of, if we live until the sun dies, then we will be as different then as we currently are now to bacteria, because, approximate timescales, 3 billion years or whatever. And so it made me think of, well, what would we be then? That if bacteria to us is so incomprehensible, it's like impossible to comprehend what we would be in 3 billion years. So just as a little fun thought experiment, do you have any thoughts around what could we be in 3 billion years as a species if we survive?
If, oh my God. Well, hopefully we'd be photosynthetic by then, because that would shortcut an awful lot of complications on this planet in terms of food pyramids and supply chain type stuff. So that would be
Yeah.
nice. God, what would we be?
Mm.
It's hard enough to imagine how we're getting past the next couple of years, but that may just be because my country has a presidential election coming up this fall that
Yeah.
may determine our future as a democracy or
Mm.
not. Um, all I can fall back on um, is this great quote, this evolutionary biologist Haldane from the last century. He was a cool evolutionary biologist, but he was also this Marxist rabble rouser, and he was also a very good writer, and he wrote for all these Marxist newspapers about evolutionary biology. Cool guy who once said, "Life is not only stranger than we imagine, life is stranger than we can imagine."
Mm.
And I think all that one can come up with is whatever you could predict. It's not going to be that. That's the one thing predictable.
That's a wonderful answer. I like that. So I have a crazy idea that I know it won't be this for exactly the reason that you're making there. But, we have to get so crazy once we're at that scale that, the photosynthesis, I think, is a really interesting idea. Maybe that would be part of my picture as well. But maybe that we would eventually become like non-physical beings in some way, right? And I know that's crazy, but we've got to get crazy for this, right? And so I think, and with AI, which has a whole lot of dangers as well, but if that could go in a positive direction, we have machines and AI that we could export our physical labor and our cognitive labor onto. And then what's left for us to do, the evolutionary pressure is to just like optimize well-being for all our humans. How would we do that? Well, we don't need our minds or our bodies anymore unless we want our minds. And so then there's kind of evolutionary pressure toward, well, let's get rid of the bodies. And then what happens? And let's transcend tribalism. And maybe we end up as this kind of unified, non-physical energy field or something, which makes me think of Tesla. I always think of Tesla's idea of, if you want to understand the universe, think in terms of frequency, energy, and vibration. So I know that's a totally nutty idea, but it's just a bit of fun to think that far out and to have some signposts to work toward. Not that that's a practical signpost to work toward, but to think about the idea of, more harmony and unity. And that's just kind of the part of me that's an inner hippie, I think, in there.
And that would be great. The only thing I would hold out for, if we toss this corporeal existence aside, I personally would love to have a prehensile tail. So it would be nice if that were part of the future, that if you could have a prehensile tail.
That's so
and
cute.
Otherwise, this cloud of possibilities.
Yeah, I love it. So I want to give the most controversial provocation for you. So in the free will space, people who are arguing there's no free will, to my eye, are always left leaning, right? Or if not quite far left. And that makes sense to me because, a lot of the conclusions of no free will, tilt toward compassion and understanding and, external locus of control and explaining people's behaviors through things that happen to them. And so that makes total sense to me. But as a person who's kind of politically homeless and, don't feel like I have a political tribe, and this middle way thing, right? I'm always trying to look for what are the best arguments on both sides and what are the best perspectives on both sides. I've never heard kind of a right-wing perspective on what might be some conclusions around free will. And so I'm curious to hear you respond to this, because I know you've openly said a bit of a card-carrying lefty and NPR listener, and that's all wonderful. So I would argue that if I'm trying to make the best argument from a right-wing perspective, it might say something like, well, understanding there's no free will emphasizes the importance of incentives, that we are being merely pushed around by our environment, And so, as much as you could go as far left as you want, you could go to, conclusions could go, well, we need to go full communist, full hardcore equity. A person who works 100 hours a week gets paid the same as a person who doesn't do any work because they didn't choose to become that kind of person. You could totally make that argument on that side. But on the other side, you could kind of go far right and say, okay, let's go, fascism here and say death penalty and really harsh punishments. And again, I'm not saying I agree with either of these positions, but I'm saying there could be an argument for the power of incentives and the importance of holding people responsible in order to optimize sentient well-being from a perspective of, well, we've got to push people away from unhelpful, hurtful behaviors and push people toward the good ones. Can you see any merit in that?
I could see at least two ways in which a right-wing stance gets you to an argument against free will. The first one is one of the ironies when it comes to like what genes have to do with behavior, and there's been a lot of there's been a lot of pseudoscience. There's been a lot of damage built around the notion of genes being more powerful than they actually are, and there's a general sort of attitude that it's a leftist stance by now to play down how powerful genes are and their effects on behavior, and it's a more conservative stance. But there's a domain in which they run in absolute opposite directions. If you are a conventional progressive leftist, there's a realm in which you view something as highly biological, highly fixed, highly undeterred by whatever societal things you invent, and that's your sexual orientation. And at the same time, there's a realm in which you think this trait is highly subject to what sort of environment you grow up in, and which is IQ. And then you look at a typical right-wing stance, and IQ is a realm in which it is a biologically fixed trait, and sexual orientation, oh my God, that's a choice. And thus we could convince somebody not to do something this sinful. And it's just ironic to me that, it's not implicitly a progressive view or a conservative view to take either of those stances. As usual, it conveniently depends on what the particular issue is. So that's potentially a realm with a right-wing view. The other one is, taken right-wing as far out into the sort of toxic realm you were alluding to. This last century saw the invention of a lack of free will argument that took the form of, don't blame me, I was coerced. I was just following orders. An entire country worth of people who marched people off to death camps appeal to a lack of free will stance there. I was just following orders. So I think, like an awful lot of this stuff, they're double-edged swords and they can cut both ways, and be careful what you wish for. And laws of unexpected consequences will bite you in the ass every time. So yeah, amid having a general feel for this is a more progressive stance, there's room for it to come back in some pretty horrifying forms.
Yeah, you made such good points there around the double-edged nature of all things, right? Not all things, but so many things. So last question that I want to put to you before we finish with a meditation. So, again, in the spirit of this middle way vibe that I'm running with, what is an idea or a topic on which you've either changed your mind due to realizing maybe a bit of a tribal bias, or maybe an opinion you currently hold that you think is most likely to be held due to bias, or even if you think you agree with your position that there's still bias in the system there and you can see it operating. Do you have an answer for any of those?
Yeah, one area in which I've changed is back when I was like it was a caricature of like a nice liberal and all of that, and like all sorts of things where I said, well, yes, we need some reform there, but like don't toss the apple cart over or whatever, where I was like a very nice conventional one. And I am far, far to the left of that now. And that's entirely due to the influence of my wife, who got raised by a wonderful commie father who, so that trickled through. So I was like now an embarrassingly like diluted liberal back when. So I'm so far to the left of like the likes, at least in my country, of someone like Bernie Sanders and such.
Mm.
So I've changed that way, a realm where I sure hope I do change because I have to fight this tendency and I know what's wrong and all of that. But I look at my students and I got a seminar full of them and there's a dozen of them. And there's one kid in there who's amazing. They just, you can see, they get it before anybody else does. You see them just putting the pieces together and all of that. And it's like so cool to watch. And then there's everybody else in there who's doing a good. And then there's another kid who, okay, they're not quite, they're at that end of the distribution. They're not, but damn, you could see them working hard. And
Mm.
when they put in a paper, they just work their asses off on that. And my particular residual belief in free will is such that, like, I really want to like reward them more.
Mm.
Like the ones who were working hard in there as opposed to the ones who have the natural abilities. And that's totally indefensible and that's intellectually and ethically insupportable. But like that's one like I like those students that I go out of my way if they're like 1 point on this side of a grade change, I'm going to find a way to decide that actually they were half a point on the other side. So yeah, that's completely unacceptable. So I don't know, maybe I'll get that one out of my system at some point. But if I do, that'll be right around the time where I will decide it's like impossible for me to just follow orders and hand out grades to students anyway. So that'll all be down the line, perhaps.
Yeah. Could you argue that that bias maybe has some wisdom in that instrumental way of like it's your little way unconsciously of encouraging people to work hard?
Oh, absolutely. I
Yeah.
have a colleague, staff, psychologist Carol Dweck,
Mm.
who has taught every neurotic middle class family on earth a critical thing, which is if your kid succeeds at something, do not say to them, that is so wonderful how well you did. You must be so smart. Say to them, oh, that's so wonderful. You must have worked so hard. And
Mm.
yeah, that's totally instrumental prescription there. So yeah, maybe I'm holding out for that because it has a certain instrumental value.
Yeah, sure. Beautiful. Okay, well, then now let's do a brief meta meditation. So, for those of you who don't know what a meta meditation is, it's essentially sending loving kindness to all beings, different versions of how you can go about doing that. But we'll just run through a really brief one now. So, I'll get everyone to close their eyes and take a couple of deep breaths in your own time. And then just let your breathing be whatever it is in this moment. And now I want you to generate a feeling of love in your heart, whatever level you're currently able to generate, by thinking of someone or something that it is very easy to love for you. So this might be a partner or a sibling or a friend or a favorite teddy bear or something. And it's not a cognitive exercise, it is an emotional experiential exercise. So try to bring up that feeling as vividly as you can. No judgment about how much or how little you can bring it up. And I want you to send the message to this person of loving kindness, that you love them, that you care for them, that you wish them to be well, that you wish them to be happy. Really say that in your mind toward this person, an image of this person, a feeling of this person. And then you can spend a long time doing graded versions of this, but we'll just do a brief version. You want to spread that love out from where it's easy to feel it and send it out to initially people for whom it's maybe a little more complicated, but easy enough. And then maybe to people that it's actually quite difficult to feel that for. And eventually spreading that to all beings. Anyone, anything that can experience love, joy, suffering, the spectrum of emotion. Sending loving kindness to this being, to these beings. And when you're doing that, you're trying to connect to the feeling of love in your own heart that can come from when you're sending love and care and compassion to others. It's a beautiful virtuous cycle. When we love someone, it brings up love in us. To be in love is to be in a state of love. It's a state that we're generating as we give it to others. And then you might want to even practice letting go of having any direction where you're sending the love and merely radiating that state of love. And you might also want to play with sending those sentiments and that love toward yourself. And in your own time, opening your eyes. So that will do us for today. Robert, I can't thank you enough on so many levels for your time, first of all, but for the extraordinary amount of effort that you've put into this remarkable book, and also for personifying an archetype of what I would love people of your level of expertise to be like. The fact that you are a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient, that I'm sure makes you cringe to think about because of your ideas around dessert. But they don't just hand those out to anybody. And the fact that you're the kind of person who wound up being someone to receive something like that, and yet you're so affable and open-minded and pleasant and kind and warm. It's just it's remarkable to see that combination of traits in someone. So thank you for being exactly who you are.
Well, thank you. I can assure you there's plenty of times I'm a jerk. But no,
I'm sure that's true because you're human. We all are. But yes, thank you nonetheless for things that you didn't earn, but that nevertheless flow through.
well, thanks for having me on and a really fun conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Robert. Take care.
You too. Take care.
Robert Sapolsky, ladies and gentlemen. So I would like to just add a few extra bits here. There's some reflections I'd like to make about the podcast and some extra bits I'd like to have gotten to in this conversation. First of all, I'd just like to lay out some of my arguments against libertarian free will. So we've kind of taken that as assumed a little bit in this conversation. So there's a few different ways that I think we can approach this best. First of all, I think we can paint the picture of the dance of biology and environment. So if we think of what we are as an organism, we are created, the beginnings of our life comes from our mother's egg and our father's sperm. This creates the beginnings of something that I think most people would say does not have free will in this beginning moment, but that it develops at some point. But if you just logically step out the process, there's no space for free will to arise. So you have an embryo that develops in the environment of the womb, and there's a constant dance between that initial form that it took and the environment in which it exists, and the nutrients being fed to it, etc. And that creates subsequent moments of this embryo taking on new forms, and that develops a baby in the womb. And then at some point, whenever you want to say that the first moment of a free choice exists, this organism has become exactly what it is due to no free will of its own. Because you're saying this is the first choice point. Let's say time equals 0. And whatever it is, whatever we are in that first moment, is interacting with an environment. So we didn't choose who we are, and we didn't choose the environment, because this is the first moment of free choice that you're claiming exists. The outcome of that choice is only a product either of what this thing is and its particular preferences over which you had no free choice, and the environment over which you had no free choice interacting. Either that's fully determinative of what that first choice or action will be, or it's not. And if it's not, it's randomness. Either it's because of what this system is and because of what the environment is, or it's not. And so there's no room for free choice in that moment. And the choice that it makes will determine at time 1 what kind of system it is, because the choices we make, change who we are. And it also interacts with the environment and changes the environment in some way. So let's say you chose chocolate ice cream in your first moment of choosing. That changes the environment because now there's less chocolate ice cream in the environment. There's a higher demand for chocolate ice cream in the environment. That might affect prices and popularity, trends, etc., however small. And it changes you because you have now just ingested chocolate ice cream. And then your system is interacting with chocolate ice cream. And now you're a person who's tried chocolate ice cream that is subtly different to a person who tried vanilla ice cream. And then, so who we are at time 1 is now different, however slightly, because of that choice. And the environment is now different at time 1, partly because of that choice, partly because of the changing environment that's happening at all times. So then the next choice we make at time 1 is only a product of who we are at time 1 and the environment at time 1, or randomness in the system. So that choice will again not be free. And this is all we ever are, is this dance between biology and environment. And there's no space for a free choice to arise there. That's one way we can think about it. Another argument is this idea that you can perform your wants, but you can't choose your wants. You can't want to want what you want. You have a preference for chocolate ice cream that just arose, and you can't want to prefer vanilla ice cream. And if a want arises in you to prefer vanilla ice cream, that will be for some reason of what came before as well. So you may choose to want to like vanilla ice cream to try to prove that you have free will. Well, that's because of the kind of person that you are who wants to prove that free will exists. But the actual desire of the system is whatever it is. You can't want it to be different. And any want that arises to want it to be different is just taking back a step. You can't ever create a want outside of a want that just arises out of nowhere. So absolutely you can do what you want, but you can't want what you want. And so if you can't want what you want, then you are free in the compatibilist sense of, as long as you are not externally coerced, you are free to engage your wants as you see fit, but you are not free if those wants are merely arising in your system and compelling you to act in certain ways. Another way to think about, or another point to address, is the idea of souls. So some people say that, well, yes, if we live in a material world, then there isn't free will, but there is a supernatural or a soul that is this dualistic argument. There's a soul that exists that can act outside of material cause and effect. So an issue with this is that you don't choose your soul, and your soul has its particular preferences, whether it's material cause and effect kind of preferences, but either it doesn't have preferences, in which case it will act randomly, or it has particular preferences that are different to another soul. And that means that it will act based on those preferences. Or all souls are exactly the same and they all have exactly the same preferences, and that's no more free. It just means we would all do exactly the same thing if we were put into the same physical body interacting with the same physical environment. But there's no freedom in any of that. And if you say you did choose your soul, then it's just an infinite regress of what is the you doing the choosing. And whatever label you want to give it, this you that is doing choosing either doesn't have preferences, in which case it will choose randomly, or it has preferences, in which case it will act according to those preferences. And it didn't choose those preferences. And if you want to say that it did, then you're stuck in an infinite regress of something. There has to be preferences that weren't freely chosen. So they're just some of the clear arguments for mine that dispute libertarian free will. As I've said, I think it's a better rational argument against it rather than an empirical one, because we don't have proof empirically that it doesn't exist, and we may never. But empiricism is pointing in the direction of backing up the rational argument, and that's what Sapolsky's book does such a great job of, is telling that empirical story. Reflecting on the podcast, there's a few things I would have liked to have raised or pushed a little harder on. So I think the main regret that I have, because regret is something you can still have when you don't believe in free will. There are versions of regret perhaps, but a pragmatic reflection on what you did and what you can learn from it, what you would have liked to have done better, that can all still be useful in a forward-looking sense. So something I would have liked to have pressed him a little more on is trying to get him to concede the version of free will that compatibilists say we have, that of course we have this, it's just we have it to varying degrees and we arguably shouldn't call it free will. So when I put this to him, he went to a specific case. I think it was a eating chocolate ice cream specific case of a person who didn't have control in that context. And I put it to him around, well, if a person didn't have control to not murder when they get angry, we would lock that person away. And I thought that, got him to concede that, yes, we do have to respond practically to if people don't have this kind of self-control. But I didn't then zoom out again and make the generally wider point that we do generally endow one another with some capacity for self-control that is sufficient to hold one another responsible. And that's both legally and in terms of just interpersonal interactions, and that people would want to be held responsible. This is what Dennett talks about when he talks about people wanting to be members of the Moral Agents Club, because people want to be endowed with having this kind of control so that we don't lock them away, or we don't say you can't enter contracts, or I don't want to interact with you because I don't trust that you have enough self-control. So I would have just liked to have drilled down on that a little more to get him to kind of concede really that, the widest point of this is that compatibilists and incompatibilists are basically taking exactly the same position. And I know both people on both sides of that fence will hate that assertion. And of course, there are ways in which that is not true, but in the most important ways, I think it is. So most reasonable compatibilists are rejecting libertarian free will. They're saying, of course, that doesn't exist. So that's people like Dan Dennett are doing that. And reasonable hard incompatibilists are acknowledging that we have a capacity for self-control and that it's important and that we should hold people responsible and all of that lovely stuff, because they're not fatalists. And so that's the same position. We have some capacity for self-control. It's good for us to use it. We should be encouraged to use it and have a system of incentives that encourage that use. But we don't have this libertarian free will. And so the logical conclusion of them both is the same. We should be compassionate and forgiving and not hateful toward one another when people misbehave, but we should still hold people accountable for pragmatic, forward-looking reasons. And it seems it's frustrating to me as a bit of a diplomat between the two positions to see that there's so much discourse on compatibilists disagreeing with hard incompatibilists when they basically don't disagree at all on the actual position. They just disagree on whether or not to call the capacity that we have free will. So yeah, I see it as like a spectrum of free will beliefs. At one extreme, you have fatalism, which is no matter what choices you make, you're going to end up with the same fate. And I don't understand that position exactly. I haven't thought about it a lot in terms of what would be the best version of that argument. Because in the short term, I wonder whether some fatalists are disagreeing that. Anyway, I don't need to get into the specifics there. Fatalism is no matter what choices you make, you're going to end up the same way. You can't have any control of any kind over your life. That's one extreme. The other extreme is libertarian free will belief, the idea that you can act outside of cause and effect magically and somehow hold that, have ownership over that, even though it's outside of any causes. So libertarian free will and fatalism, they're the extreme views. Compatibilists and hard incompatibilists sit in the middle, where they say this doesn't exist. Again, some compatibilists are remaining, they're not taking a position on libertarian free will, and I would like more of them to be open about what their position on libertarian free will is. But compatibilism and hard incompatibilism, certainly compatibilism of Dennett's kind, sit in the middle here where they go, that's obviously not true, that's obviously not true. But in here we go, we don't have that, but we have a capacity that makes fatalism untrue, and so we should be encouraged to use it. And I just would like Dennett, Sapolsky, Sam Harris, everyone who talks about this to agree on that, or nut out any disagreement on how they would talk about that, because I think it's important for us to come together on recognizing that many of the most important things are being agreed on completely. I think an interesting point that I'd like to have raised with Sapolsky is the idea that this kind of free will that we do have, or this capacity for not acting impulsively, but pausing, deliberating, making wise choices, having these extra degrees of freedom around what to do next, is an evolved capacity that has gotten bigger over time. So we've got our older parts of the brain, our brainstem, and then our limbic system, and then our newer parts of the brain, the neocortex and the frontal lobe, is the fancy, sophisticated executive function, decision-making, the ability to consider things and not merely act impulsively. That's a newer part of the brain that has evolved over time. And this is why we have it at least at higher levels than other animals and than young children whose frontal lobe is not fully developed yet, and people with certain cognitive deficits that don't allow that system to operate sufficiently. And that this is something that will probably likely, if we survive long enough, continue to evolve, and we'll continue to get more and more of it in across some dimensions. And I haven't articulated what those dimensions might be and how they might evolve over time. But I think that's an interesting point, that we have gained more freedom over our actions, not in an absolute sense. We could only ever have done what we do, or randomness. So there's not a free sense at which we choose whatever we choose in an absolute sense. But we've gained more freedom in terms of, with a certain input, this system can do different kinds of output. And that capacity to deliberate and consider lots of options, that's just a program that we have that has evolved over time and gotten bigger and provided more options over time, even if they're only potential options, and the one that we do would only ever be a result of what's going on in the dance between the biology and environment in this moment, but that is a capacity that we didn't previously have. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the quarantine model analogy. So there's the quarantine model of dealing with criminal behavior, and likening it to the quarantine model of infectious disease. This idea that we don't punish people for having infectious diseases. we just keep them away from other people so they don't hurt others, and that we should do the same with people who commit crimes. And I don't have a strong position on whether or not I endorse that. Instinctively, I feel like we're not quite ready for that. But, what's the nuance? Where's the line between what's punishment and just keeping people away? There's a lot of nuance there, but the analogy doesn't quite hold for me, because the idea that if we threaten people with punishment for criminal behavior, then that disincentivizes directly that criminal behavior. But the same is not true when it comes to an infectious disease. If we threaten a person with punishment for contracting an infectious disease or for spreading an infectious disease, in terms of the spreading, threatening a person with punishment is not going to get them to be less infectious. It's not going to affect the disease. And if you threaten them with punishment for contracting or spreading the disease in general, then it might make people become recluses or less likely to go out or be extremely careful about how they interact with other people. But that's not directly addressing the behavior that you're trying to target, which is the spread of the disease. So it's not as well targeted as punishment of criminal behavior that directly puts an incentive into a person's system that makes them less likely, all else equal, to do that kind of behavior. Now, of course, it's an empirical question as to how well punishment works, and it's not something I'm an expert in, but I just want to take issue with the analogies. It's not exactly, doesn't line up exactly with how we should treat criminal behavior based on infectious disease behavior. And similar to Sapolsky's idea of a car whose brakes don't work. If punishing a car, threatening to punish a car, if its brakes don't work, made it more likely for its brakes to work, then we might punish the car. So, the point he's making is fair in terms of trying to get rid of that retributive element and that judgment element. But, in terms of the actual pragmatic response we have to criminal behavior or bad behavior, the analogy doesn't quite hold to infectious diseases or cars' brakes not working. Another idea that's a bit edgy that I would like to have raised with Sapolsky is he has said that no one deserves to have their needs considered more than anyone else in response to this understanding of no free will. And whilst I completely agree with the sentiment of what he's saying, I don't think that's necessarily true. I'd be interested to hear him respond to the assertion that for pragmatic consequentialist reasons, we might consider one person's needs more than another. So say there's a 100-year-old man who will die in 2 seconds, and versus the head of state of a powerful country that has their finger on the nuclear button, or any example where it can become clear quite easily that it might be worth considering one person's needs more than another, that causing a bit of discomfort to one person is perhaps worthwhile if it leads to making another person slightly less likely to do an extraordinarily bad thing or slightly more likely to do an extraordinarily good thing. Another thing I wanted to get into is the idea of what do normal lay people actually believe about free will, and talk about the idea that normal people generally have a concept of compatibilist free will in a way, in the legal sense, perhaps you could say, in terms of a person acting of their own free will. The idea that a person has a version of freedom as long as they're not externally coerced. But normal people also do have this libertarian free will belief, generally speaking. And I think that helps to clarify a little bit of the confusion in the literature that talks about what belief do people have, because it's quite tricky to pass what beliefs people have. And people do seem to still say that they have a version of free will in a deterministic universe, which might be compatibilist, but also might just be smuggling in indeterminism into deterministic scenarios, as some of the literature has shown people can do. But the literature has also shown that people do think that we live generally in an indeterministic universe rather than a deterministic one, suggesting they make room for this libertarian free will belief. But I think it's important to acknowledge that people can have both concepts at once, that they can believe that they have a true freedom to act freely, but also that their ability to act on their own desires, even if they don't have that free will, is still a version of freedom that people acknowledge is different in terms of it's talking about the kind of free will of as long as you're not being externally coerced. I think people hold both those positions. Would have been interested to get into that with him. I would have liked to have asked him if he thinks true randomness exists. I don't think I asked that. I obviously don't know, but I have an instinct toward it not existing. Ultimately, I'm drawn to the idea of superdeterminism, but I don't know it deeply. Would like to have heard his perspective. Monism is another idea I would like to have raised with him. So this is the idea that rather that everything is made of one substance, basically. So generally people think that matter is primary and that mind arises out of matter. So materialists or physicalists thinks that consciousness arises out of a certain organization of elements of matter. And then there are idealists who think that consciousness is primary and matter is merely that which is arising inside of consciousness. Or there's the possibility of a third thing in the mix there, where rather than consciousness giving rise to matter or matter giving rise to consciousness, that there's something else creating these other two highly correlated things. I think there's a bit of an overlap between the idea of monism and the no separate self stuff. This, Alan Watts talks about this in the book on the taboo against knowing who you are. This idea that, of course, we are separate according to certain criteria. This physical human body is different to a different physical human body. But on another level, we are all just atoms, say, and it's just a sea of stuff and certain collections of atoms create separate people on that different level. I also want to talk about Sapolsky's pushback against Dan Dennett's assertion that luck evens out in the long run. So Sapolsky disagrees with this and says, no, actually luck can, if you're underprivileged in the beginning, then over time things are likely to get harder over time. And if you're privileged in the beginning, it's likely to create more opportunity. And I agree with that. But just to steelman Dan's position, I think perhaps the point he was trying to make was that if we encourage people to use their capacity for self-control, this compatibilist free will that he would want to call it, and people do engage that, by making wise choices over time, you can overcome the bad situation that you were put in the beginning. It's just that it would be important to, whilst acknowledging that, I would say, acknowledging that you will only do as good of a job at engaging wise choices as you're capable, because there's no libertarian free will. And I'd like to hear Dan consider that a bit more, but it would have been good to get into that with Sapolsky. Another issue I have with something Dan Dennett says is that he says it's philosophers who've created libertarian free will, and I think that's honestly absurd, to the point that maybe I'd be curious to know exactly what he means by that, because they may have invented the label, sure, but he seems to dismiss it so quickly as if nobody believes that almost. It's what everybody believes. Not everybody, but it's certainly the majority of people. I think Dan seems to maybe be surrounded by a lot of very intelligent people, the whole ivory tower problem. I'm sure that he would have a comeback for that, but if you go and speak to normal people on the street, it's not that they believe it, it's that they have never considered the possibility that it's not true. So it's just a fundamental part of their life that, of course, it exists. And if people like Sapolsky, and there are certainly enough of them who don't believe in free will and yet can't get over the feeling of having had it, that's some pretty good evidence of having it. That's some pretty good evidence that the natural state is for people to feel like they have this capacity. And I just can't imagine that normal people are walking around either as hard determinists or hard incompatibilists, and or people aren't walking around thinking, I don't have libertarian free will, but I have this other capacity. And so when people are endorsing free will, I don't think they're endorsing only this compatibilist version and being like, no, of course I don't have that libertarian free will belief, because even 13% odd of professional philosophers believe in it. So what hope do lay people have? So I'd be curious to hear Dan's pushback to that. So I just also would have liked to just lay out a bit more clearly, which I can just do now, what my position is on how we should think about free will. And of course I don't know, and this is part of what I'm trying to look at in my research, is how do people respond to different positions or assertions about free will. But I have my current position is that at some point we should abandon libertarian free will belief altogether and pivot to either compatibilist free will or no free will, with retaining a salience of this capacity for controlling ourselves and making choices that determine outcomes in our lives. So I don't know if we're ready for that yet en masse, but I think certainly some of us are, and we should move in that direction. So when you look at the literature, it's a bit of a confusing picture. If you look at the correlational research, free will belief correlates positively with a number of good outcomes in life, suggesting that it might be useful to have high levels of free will belief. But there's a big issue in that the scales used to measure free will belief are capturing, at least also, I would argue more so than, they're capturing compatibilist free will rather than libertarian free will. I think they're capturing both for sure, but there's certainly at least some substantial amount capturing compatibilist free will. There are items like having the ability to overcome obstacles, which you can completely disbelieve in libertarian free will and answer extremely highly if you're a compatibilist. And the authors of the most commonly used measure, or maybe the second most commonly used measure, themselves say that this is a measure of compatibilist free will. And so when we talk about the benefits of free will belief, we're often talking about compatibilist free will belief to at least some degree. And when you look at experiments that undermine free will belief, these are a little more clearly undermining libertarian free will belief, because they're usually done by exposing people to arguments that for determinism, basically. And so it's a cleaner story of them undermining libertarian free will belief, although not without risk that it might be undermining compatibilist free will belief a little bit as well. But when you look at experiments, yes, there is some evidence that can lead to some negative outcomes, but a lot of those studies fail to replicate, and at a meta-analytic level, it's been shown that downstream consequences don't tend to arise when you expose people to these ideas. That yes, it does shift their free will beliefs at a meta-analytic level, but it doesn't lead to downstream consequences generally. And that meta-analysis was conducted on studies that are overwhelmingly looking at the downsides of undermining free will belief, because that's what the literature has looked at. So the story is currently that the risks of exposing people to the idea that determinism is true or that libertarian free will isn't, true, is less risky than it seemed. Of course, it still bears risk, and I think we should tread carefully. But it's less risky to expose people to this. And the correlational research seems to be picking up largely on compatibilist free will that we can keep. And then my research is showing that people can become more self-forgiving and less shameful. And then also showing that people can become more forgiving and less hateful of other people. So when I recorded the podcast for Sapolsky, I didn't have my results yet. I've now just gotten them. And so that's part of an emerging picture of the potential upsides of undermining free will belief. So it's a complicated picture, but it seems to me that we have to face reality, and that reality is almost certainly libertarian free will belief. Libertarian free will doesn't exist. But we do have this capacity that's worthwhile to emphasize because it's good for our own well-being and it's good for our social dynamics with other people and having societies that function well for pragmatic reasons. So that's kind of my position in a nutshell. But, we'd love to rifle through that with Sapolsky and Dennett on either side and nutting that out. This is part of that roundtable that I suggested to Sapolsky. It would be so good to get Sam Harris, Sapolsky, Dennett, maybe Greg Caruso, Dirk Pereboom, Susan Blackmore, get a few of these big names on the topic together to try to nut out how we should be thinking about this. Another tricky point I wanted to raise was Sapolsky talks about how CEO suite pay is bad or irrational or whatever. I don't remember what words he used. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he seems to suggest that it's based on basic desert, and that's not true. So I'm not saying that it's not at all true, but CEOs would say that it's pure economics, that it's got nothing to do with basic desert. And of course, there'd be some people who have a basic desert fetish who really feel like, I deserve all my pay because look how hard I worked as a CEO. And those people deserve less than me. Of course, there'd be people like that, but we needn't have that logic in there to justify very high CEO pay. You could argue that it's purely to attract the best people to the job, and it's an incredibly important job, and then that they provide value equal to or greater than what they're being paid, because otherwise it would be irrational for the company to hire them and pay them lots and lots of money. And so it's a capitalist argument. So this idea that capitalism, for all of its flaws, you can justify it from a purely pragmatic perspective without having to appeal to basic desert at all. And so this picture of what economic system should we have in the face of no free will, I think is a really interesting one. And I kind of touched a little bit on the left versus right with Sapolsky, but you could go full communist or full unfettered capitalism as either extreme and look at, well, where does free will sit in that? And on that spectrum, free will maybe at face value, lack of free will, incorporating that idea maybe tilts a little more toward the communist end of the spectrum because, what a beautiful idea. From each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. Sounds wonderful. And if nobody earned their ability, then it makes sense to spread the fruits of that ability among people evenly. Beautiful ideal, but it doesn't work pragmatically because humans have a human nature, and capitalism is much more pragmatic around incorporating that human nature, that we need incentives and we need disincentives. And humans are incentivized by financial reward, and that's just a reality. And people are unlikely to work equally hard if they're not being remunerated well. And so you can say it doesn't matter if there's no free will, we can still have even strongly capitalist system because we think it leads to the best outcomes. So that an important thing to acknowledge as part of that is at this point of human evolution, because I think it's worth acknowledging that at a future point of human evolution, we will very likely, if we keep evolving the way that we are for long enough, that we can get better at either of those systems. That if we were perfect beings, fully enlightened, and then either of those systems would work. If we had communism, then a fully enlightened, perfect being would still work extremely hard without any incentives to do so, and be fine with that, the fruits of that labor being spread elsewhere. And if we were perfect, enlightened beings, then in the face of gaining personally many fruits of your labor, your efforts and productivity, you would not hoard it at all, and you would perfectly distribute it toward whatever ends that optimize sentient well-being. And that's not the world that we live in, but just making the point that it's not about the system, it's about human nature and incentivizing it in the right ways. And so we needn't have a sense of basic desert to justify a capitalist system, basically. I also wanted to talk about, I have an idea for developing a clinical intervention strategy based on the idea of no self. So it's basically just kind of formalizing the Buddhist assertion that the understanding and the realization of no self alleviates suffering. If you look at two very common current intervention strategies, CBT and ACT, cognitive behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy. So ACT is a bit of an outgrowth of CBT, technically falls under the umbrella, but has a very different approach. So CBT is, say you have negative thoughts that are hurting this self, let's change the thoughts so that the self is less hurt. ACT is a bit of an evolution of that, saying, well, that necessarily implies that thoughts are dangerous. And so let's try to, rather than push back and challenge and be at war with the thoughts, let's just allow them to be there, notice them as merely thoughts, and practice being less hurt by them, so undermining the effect that they can have on us. But still, the self is at the center of that. I'm interested to go to another level of evolution where that self can be completely abandoned. Now, ACT provides an in for this. ACT has a concept of self as context, which is to say that the self is the context in which everything is happening. So it's encouraging us to practice softening our conceptual versions of self and identifying, at least in moments, with the context in which it's all arising. So something like pure awareness. And I'd be interested to take this further and really formalize training around undermining the sense of a self and integrating that into existing modalities without having to appeal to Buddhism. So I'd be interested to hear his thoughts on that. And of course, we'd have to be very careful because it's a destabilizing idea, but fully embracing the fact that there's no free will and there's no self, the two sides of the same coin, has enormous promise for us psychologically. And if we can do it the right way, we're really undermining the core of all suffering. And so, yeah, a kind of no free will, no self-transcendence therapy, I think could be really useful. It's nothing new, really. It's just formalizing other things that have been said before. Another controversial thing that I would have been interested to raise was, if we have two groups of people and they're both exactly the same biologically and they are given exactly the same environment, then they will, in a fully determined universe, behave exactly the same. If there's randomness in the system, they'll behave a bit differently, but not through any free choice. If you have two biological groups that are exactly the same, but they have different environments, then they will behave differently. Nothing controversial there. If we concede that a big environmental influence is culture, Then if we have one culture interacting with the same biology versus a different culture, then there will be different outcomes. And I'm not saying that all people are biologically exactly the same. Of course, they're not, or all groups of people. But just saying that to isolate the culture factor, that clearly culture has an effect on outcomes. And we have to be able to acknowledge this truth without being afraid to talk about it because of the fact that people will use that conclusion toward very unhelpful and harmful ends. So it's not to get into cultural supremacy or castigating cultures as inferior, but at the very least to acknowledge that there will be different cost-benefit analysis profiles, that this culture leads to certain benefits and certain costs, and this culture leads to certain other benefits and costs. And we can look at all the cultures that emerge and go, oh, can we learn something from one another? And that can be a beautiful thing to do, but that will require some difficult questions to be asked around, does it seem like that culture is actually not doing a very good job of optimizing sentient well-being? So, yeah, through no free will, we can acknowledge that culture serves a big role in how we behave, and that if you have different culture, it will lead to different behavior. So that'll do me. Thank you all for tuning in. And until next time, sending you all love and reason.